Welcome back to Nightly Nonsense, where we make some sense out of the nonsense all around us. Hey, we've been talking about this whole God sense thing. How does God view all of these things, right? I told you last night I wanted to talk about this idea. You know what? The key to making sense out of the nonsense is you have to want to make sense out of the nonsense, which means you have to be willing to admit that you're talking nonsense, that you're in nonsense, you've been applying nonsense, all of these things, right? Are you willing to do that? Are you willing to admit that you've been walking in nonsense, that part of your life is nonsense, right? Hey, I haven't been thinking right, haven't been acting right, haven't been talking right, right? That's a big deal. You have to look at things and be willing to say, my way isn't working. It's just a bunch of nonsense. It's the hardest thing. Some of us are super successful. Doesn't make sense for us to say that we're living in nonsense. But we are. If we're living without Jesus, you are. Not from the standpoint of you're unsuccessful, but you think you're successful, but from the standpoint of you're successful, but you're not using any of it in the plan that God has for you. Right? You're taking the gifts, you're taking the talents, and you're using it for yourself. Super, super, super important for us to understand that you can be totally successful in the world's eyes using all your gifts and your talents for yourself. Right? You have to be willing to say, that doesn't make sense to God. What makes sense to God is that I take my gifts, my talents, and I use them in His plan and His purpose for my life. Some of us, we know that we're nonsense, but we're so busy trying to make it be sensical. Right? We're so trying because we don't want to admit that we're a failure. We don't want to admit that we need Jesus. We don't want to admit that we got it wrong. Some of us are in relationships that we just got it wrong. But we don't want to admit it because then it means we've failed. And listen, there's a price for failing. Right? In our world. There's a cost for failing in our world. But in God's economy, there's someone who covered that cost for your failure. And every time you're trying to figure it out, you're robbing God of paying the price for you. We do not sin, right? So that grace can abound. That's not what I'm talking about. Oh, just go out and sin so that we can need more Jesus. We need more Jesus, more Jesus. No. But when you're fighting so hard to refuse to admit that you need Jesus, you got a problem. Right? You got a problem. So again, tonight, super short nightly nonsense because you have homework to do. Right? Are you willing to look all around you, point out the things? My health, it's just nonsense. I got to figure this out. What does God say about my health? Right? Just because I can eat 12 donuts a day doesn't mean God says that makes sense. Right? My finances, just because my bank account has got 6 zeros attached to it, it doesn't mean that God says it makes sense. Just because I've reached the top level in my job doesn't mean God thinks that makes sense. Just because I'm dating the most beautiful person in the world doesn't mean that God makes sense. Just because I got 3-4 kids, right? Doesn't mean that God has sense out of the whole thing. Are you willing to look around you and say, if I'm walking out my life without Jesus Christ, I'm living in nonsense, even if it makes sense to the whole world around me. The second that you become a Christian, when you got everything, if you think your friends and your family members are going to say, yay, that makes sense to me, crazy. The first time you say to them, yeah, not going out tonight with you guys. Yep, not going to support that. Yep, not going to do that. All of a sudden, your world is going to seem nonsensical to the non-Christian. I want to talk about that next time. I got lots for you to chew on tonight. So you go ahead, chew on that. We'll see you next time. Nightly Nonsense.